Hello, and welcome back to the Mindful and Messy podcast with Mihlali Mpopo. Is it me, or is this year somehow crawling along but also speeding by at the same time? I swear we're living in the twilight zone. Today, we'll be diving into part 2 of our episode on grief. In part 1, we discussed the emotions from the initial shock and arrangements after a death. In this final episode of the season, I'll be sharing mine and some of our listeners' experiences with the aftermath of grief. So, months and years later, when things have settled down, what is life like, and what can long term grief look like? Stay tuned. So, about 6 months after the funeral, a friend asked me how I was feeling about everything. And I remember using the word untethered specifically. Maybe it was having recently watched Jordan Peele's Us, but that was the only term I could think of to accurately describe what I was feeling. The Cambridge Dictionary defines untethered as not physically connected or fastened to something. This word is so fitting to me because to be tethered is to be connected or fastened to something. So the term itself denotes some kind of safety and stability. Untethered is the loss of connection and that security of being fastened to something. As I think is the norm, our parents and loved ones are our primary tethers in this world. A fact that you never really think about until that tether is severed. In my mind's eye, I saw that Vodacom for You advert with the baby in a spacesuit with the cord dangling out in space. Just the static of no up or down or sideways, just floating in an undefined space. Like a ship stuck in the doldrums, waiting for the wind to carry it in whatever direction. I felt like that for a solid 2 years, and only recently have I been feeling more grounded. But really, the underlying feeling has never gone away. There are still days I'll be working around the house or out with friends, and it will dawn on me all of a sudden that I'm an orphan, that there is no mom or dad at home, no one to call or worry about, and it's a really strange feeling. I still have my parents' contact numbers and details unchanged on my phone and documents. I remember meaning to delete them in the early days, but I just never got around to doing it. And now I realize there's no need to rush this process or get on top of it, as I constantly find myself trying to do. So I haven't actively deleted anything. It would also feel unnecessarily final, like they already did. What's the harm in keeping the little pieces of their memories that I'm able to hold on to? I've never actually called the numbers, nor do I even look at them. I think I'm just comforted knowing that if I scroll down or search their initials on my contact list, I would find them there. The thing about grief is no one else will feel your emotions or understand the strange ways you'll find to cope with and commemorate the absence of your loved ones, but do it anyway. Like, find your tethers in their favorite music, in your special memories of them or their unique quirks and the things that they loved. It will help you feel closer to them and the lovely moments you once lived together. The losses after the loss. So when we talk about the initial loss and grief, it's centered on the person that has passed on and how they were connected to everyone's lives. What we don't often think about are the far reaching ripple effects losing a loved one has on the grievers and their lives processing that grief from that moment on. There are many other losses after a loss of friends and family, loss of employment, loss of status, loss of future plans, and loss of self in this lonely world thrust upon you by unchangeable circumstances. We don't like to speak about the dysfunctional ways some of our families are made up, all the unspoken feuds and open alliances that came before us and will probably live on after us that create a toxic environment for everyone involved. Relatives and cousins turning on you in your hour of need out of pettiness, misguided loyalty, and just all out greed. All over the world, we see the soap opera trope of families that suddenly switch up into evil monsters you've never met, fighting about money, property, children, and all sorts of things after the funeral. I had heard these stories, and I had a close friend deal with a particularly explosive case involving their siblings, but would have sworn up and down that it would never happen to my family. Well, never say never. It's a bewildering experience being in the middle of the worst time of your life and having your support system and the people you thought you'd be able to count on just not show up for you. In some cases, people struggle to relate and comfort you in your grief, which is a normal and valid reaction, but we can't deny how damaging it can be to the grieving party. At their moment of need, for whatever reason, they are left to fend for themselves. In nefarious cases, you find that what you thought was a person who cared about you in life was only interested in you in relation to the person who has passed on and what that meant to them. You find the family and community you thought you had built was only in the interest of looking a certain way or being associated with certain people. You see the veil lifted on underlying dynamics that have been happening around you and the way resentment and bitterness can poison relationships. It's a disappointing reality that death changes you and can change the people around you. And that's not something you can ever really prepare for or really anything you can do anything about. As we get older, the ways our friendships come together and what keeps them together changes. What we hope, though, is that the mutual contract of love and support remains the same, and never does one need their friends more than when they are going through a difficult time. From condolences to regular check ins to catch up dates, some friends showed up and really carried me in a way they will never understand. What surprised me were the people I thought were solid friends who barely acknowledged my situation or were quickly bored with it because it wasn't fun and light, I guess. I was so heartbroken to realize over and over again that only my life had changed. The rest of the world and its ways were still intact. I found out I had a lot of acquaintances, party friends, work buddies, and numbers in my phone. But when the chips were down, I actually had few friends. It was confusing and sobering to realize I had overestimated my importance in certain people's lives and that I spent a lot of time and energy on people who didn't appreciate or reciprocate it. And in all the hurt and resentment, I also realized I was actually given very valuable information. Now I knew who I should continue giving my time and energy to and who to disengage from. It may seem harsh, but I realized that I no longer had the capacity to deal with lukewarm energy and unreliable people who didn't share my values of loyalty and reciprocity. Of course, that decision canceled out a lot of people. And it really sucks to be in my late 20s with barely any friends, going through many changes, and feeling like the biggest loser some days. But what it has also left behind is a select few people who get it and sincerely show up for me in all my life's journeys. And at the end of the day, really all I feel is grateful. On loss of self, now 3 years later and weeks away from turning 30, I can see the many different versions of myself, how and why they came about, which ones still linger on in my subconscious, and which ones have long gone. I can see how they all shaped me into the person I am at this moment. The passing of my mother and dealing with the grief of that has been a major catalyst for change in my life. It feels like I've become another person, facing my own mortality and what my life means to me forced me to ask myself some hard questions, look at situations from a different perspective, and force myself to take actions on the things I'd been too scared to do, like leaving a toxic job, cutting ties with draining friends, starting a more fulfilling career, and making the lifestyle adjustments necessary for my long term success. With new eyes, I'm looking at old memories and learning new things about my family, about purpose, about what my goals are for the future and the rest of my life. I was interested in understanding this surge of renewed energy and focus in my life in the midst of all this grief. And that's when I discovered something called post traumatic growth. So, researchers define post traumatic growth as positive psychological change experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. So, what does post traumatic growth look like? Well, there are five major domains. Number one, greater appreciation of life and or changed sense of priorities. Number two, more intimate, deeper, or warmer relationships with others. Number three, a sense of increased or discovered personal strength. Number four, openness to new possibilities in life. And number five, spiritual growth. I was relieved to discover this research and the stories of how others survived and thrived in the aftermath of their trauma and tragedy. Of course, post traumatic growth is not possible for everyone, whether it's grief or trauma related. It's also not to be confused with the what doesn't kill you makes you stronger philosophy that can be dismissive as if it isn't perfectly natural to be negatively affected by adverse circumstances. There is no obligation to improve your life or force some inspirational result to be perceived as strong or progressing past your trauma or grief. Whatever experience you find yourself in is what is true and valid for you in that moment. I share the story of post traumatic growth because it was never something I knew about or even thought possible for me. I thought that such a tragedy would surely end me and any goodness in the world. But I was surprised with this pivot that has changed the course of my entire life. I'm not happy about how I got to this point, but I am happy that with the cards I was dealt, I was able to build something bolder and more beautiful than what I thought possible. I think it's important when life changes and transitions happen to connect and share with people in similar situations. Grappling with these confusing feelings of joy, guilt, excitement, shame, and everything under the sun, I reached out to some online communities. On a Grievous forum, I recently asked fellow orphaned members what were the unexpected things they realized in the aftermath of their grief. So, Anonymous, age 25, twin girls, shared that we loved our father. He was a present and dedicated parent, but we'd always had a difficult relationship. He was a hard man to please. He lived his life in a specific way and thought that was the correct way for everyone to live as well. As a result, I think my siblings and I are more liberal and struggle with order and authority in rebellion of that strict upbringing. We hadn't realized how imprisoning his presence could be. Not intentionally or even maliciously, but we realized that was the dynamic. A few months after he passed, we realized we felt a little relieved to not have him sitting broodingly in front of the TV, sucking all the light out of the room. We realized we didn't have any expectations to live up to anymore. We had no one to disappoint with our different ways of expressing ourselves and our contentious opinions. For the first time in our lives, we felt like we were our own people and no longer an extension of our Father's wishes for us and about us. In the aftermath of our grief, we didn't expect to feel free and the guilt that came with that. So, Anonymous 31-year-old man, he had to share and say, I realized a lot of my identity was formed in relation to my sisters and our family dynamic. I was the youngest and the most carefree/careless person that everyone felt the need to coddle and protect. In their absence, I realized I had internalized a lot of their opinions of me, and when they passed on, I realized the version of me that also believed I was weak and irresponsible, that I had no direction in life and wasn't cut out for the real world had to die too. I was no longer anyone's baby brother or last born. And it was crazy to realize how much my mom and sisters did to take care of me throughout life, and the reality that I now had to do that by myself. I had to grow up fast, not because I had to be strong or because I was the man of the house now, but because I knew I was capable and I wanted to make them proud. I want to be the man they sacrificed so much for, even when I didn't realize it. In the aftermath of my grief, I realized I am much smarter and sturdier than I give myself credit for. And our last sharer is an anonymous lady who is 40 years old, who shared, we were never a religious or spiritual family. My mother had been raised Catholic until her teens, but never observed anything with us, so church and God weren't really a factor in our lives. When my father passed on from cancer a few years after my mother died in a freak accident, I remembered this swell of overwhelming rage. I didn't understand why two good people could have their lives cut short just like that for no reason. In the space of 6 years, I lost my whole family, and for 4 years after that, I struggled to care about anything and anyone because I felt so empty. Nothing about life and living seemed consequential or important anymore. What was the point? I eventually found myself drawn to spirituality and religion, but from a logical perspective. I'm not entirely sold on the blind faith aspect, but I wanted to understand whatever stories were out there because I realized I needed something to believe in. When my parents were alive and my family was intact, that was my guide and my anchor on how to understand the world and my place in it. In the aftermath of my grief, I'm on a spiritual journey with myself and figuring out what makes sense for my life. So thank you so much, guys, for the feedback. And reading these stories, I felt so comforted and validated. I related to so many of the complex thoughts and emotions shared, and it helped me realize that this confusing post-traumatic growth stage can also be a natural part of the grieving process. I felt like I was in a club within a club, and it didn't matter that there were a few of us. We were living in our own new worlds, and it was something only we could understand. And as for me, now on the other side of this dark experience, I can see some of the lessons. In these past few years, I've had to unlearn and relearn a lot of identities I had taken on because of other people, wanting to fit in, or even passively sometimes because being different can just be hard and draining. I put up with a lot of negative treatment because I was scared of being lonely, or I held on too long to things because I was scared nothing better would come along, and this colored every facet of my life. I became passive and small minded in my career aspirations, romantic relationships, and friendships. There was a deep fear and insecurity that this was as good as things were ever gonna get, so just shut up and be happy. Now, having had to reclaim and rebuild myself, I have much better self worth and I'm secure in myself and who I am. Loneliness is still hard, but now it's also bittersweet because it's all this time alone learning myself that has allowed me to tap into myself and the abundance of so many of the good things that are already within me. In the aftermath of my grief, I'm healing the scared little girl who always had to please everyone and be liked. And I'm stepping into the person who is sure of their value, who is more giving, more patient, and more compassionate with themselves and other people. Grief is often a lifelong journey, so it's important to allow ourselves to be wherever we are in it, no matter how long it has been or how many times we've been there. Patience and self-compassion are important to getting through anything in life, and there's just no formula for grieving the people and things that meant so much to us. If you or someone you know is struggling with grief, please reach out to the South African Depression and Anxiety Group on their 24-hour helpline or go to their website to find resources accessible to you. There are many different support groups and message boards on the World Wide Web, if that would be more comfortable, but also please reach out to a close friend or spiritual advisor to support you through this difficult time. So that's it for season 1. Thank you so much to everyone who listened, shared, followed, and subscribed to this podcast. I've really, really enjoyed making this with some of my favorite people and hearing your feedback. I hope these episodes have given you plenty to think and feel about. Look out for our website coming soon with articles and funky playlists related to each episode at www.mindfulandmessypodcast.com. Well, until next season.